My husband went to the bank every Tuesday at exactly 2 p.m. for 38 years. That line still sounds absurd in my head, the neat rhythm of it, as if the sound of his shoes on our porch and the clack of the bank's door were part of the household calendar, like garbage day or the school recital. He would kiss my cheek at the kitchen counter, thumb the streak of flour off his sleeve if he'd been making something, and say, "Be back by 3, Maggie. Just keeping our future secure," with that half smile he used when he thought he was being clever. Tuesday at 2, clockwork, rain or shine, snow or heat wave. The day he didn't come back, I was in the produce aisle choosing avocados. I remember the way the lights slanted through the store windows, how the green skins flashed against the citrus. I was supposed to pick up a few things for dinner, maybe make him something silly like an omelet because he'd been forgetful lately. His hands had trembled, and he'd begun leaving his keys in the freezer 2 or 3 times a month. Small things, we both joked. Old man things. My son David called from the hospital. His voice was even, like the ER nurse had coached him through what to say. "Mom, you need to come," he said. "It's bad." I drove like a woman whose body had been handed over to someone else. The world grew narrow, headlights, the teeth of a median, the hospital's fluorescent hum. Bob was already gone when I reached his room. His face looked younger in death somehow, like the lines that had lived in his cheeks had softened. At the funeral, I found myself feeling 2 things at once that didn't feel like they belonged together. A tight, aching grief for the man I'd married, and a strange, impulsive relief. I told myself I felt guilty for that lightness, as if feeling any relief made me less faithful to my own sorrow. But there it was, a bright secret flicker. Grief, I learned, is not a single note. It is a chord with dissonant harmonies. We drank cheap wine from paper cups in the church basement afterward. Emily, our daughter, laughed too loud whenever someone told a story about Bob, as if the noise could hold the shape of what she would not face. She kept saying, "Dad made a million bad jokes. He loved you, Mom." She loved him. That part was true. She needed him to be the father she'd always known. Denial is a kind of love, and it is a powerful force. 3 days later, there was a letter. A plain envelope with the bank's logo in the upper left corner, and my name beside the address. I sat on the kitchen floor and stared at it the way you might stare at a storm cloud that's far off, waiting to see what it will do. My hands moved before my mind could stop them. I slid the top and read, "We write to inform you that a safe deposit box registered jointly under your names remains unopened following Mr. Thompson's passing. The estate is required to provide authorization for access." My chest tightened. Our safe deposit box. We'd never had one, not that I remembered. For 38 years, I had watched Bob walk out the door every Tuesday, with a wave, a newspaper, and that private little furrow between his eyebrows when he was thinking. I trusted him. I believed our life was open between us. That letter smelled of cold metal and a lock that didn't need a key. It had a secret. I read the letter 3 times. I called Patricia, the bank manager, a woman I had met only at the funeral reception, who now sounded surprised when I told her I didn't know about any box. "We have records showing it was set up in both your names, Mrs. Thompson," she told me, and her voice moved from professional to careful, like a person stepping on ice. "You'll need to bring identification. We can arrange to open it here with a representative present." I remember the box as if from a film. A small room with 2 bright lights and lockers, compartment after compartment of other people's lives in little metal graves. The air had the antiseptic dryness of public spaces. Patricia walked me through the steps, and when she handed the heavy key, it felt as though I had been given something beyond its physical weight. The metal key looked ordinary, but in my palm, it seemed to hum with consequences. Patricia filmed or typed things into a computer. There were witnesses, paperwork. I signed forms I barely scanned. I kept thinking of Tuesday at 2, that ritual that had been his alone, the cadence that hid itself beneath ordinary life. She opened my box and pushed the lid up. The scent that rose was paper and dust and a faint old leather. Inside were folders, manila, and labeled in a handwriting I recognized, with the soft warmth of a person knocking on a door at night. Folder 1. Investments, private in Bob's handwriting. I pulled it out and unfolded pages that were full of numbers, small print, and the shorthand of risk. Margin calls, leveraged positions, speculative funds listed with dates and amounts that made my eyes swim. The accounts he'd assured me were safe were dotted with red. Not catastrophic at first glance, but woven through with a reckless faith in a future that had failed to arrive. Folder 2. Mortgage documents. My stomach turned as I read the sums and the names. Home equity loans, 3 of them, totaling $270,000. Taken out over the last decade, when Bob's hands had been shakier and his explanations thinner. Loans denominated against the house we'd lived in for 27 years. Signed with my name, scrawled on the lines where mine should have been. The signatures were close enough to fool a stranger, but wrong enough for my eyes to feel like they had been splashed. I traced the curves mentally and felt the breast leaving me. Someone had used my name without asking me. Folder 3. Credit cards and lines of credit. Dozens of accounts, charges in places I'd never been. Balances that stacked and made a small mountain. In total, they amounted to $96,000. $96,000 in credit card debt opened in my name, with my address, with tiny photocopies of IDs that had been forged in ways that made me feel suddenly exposed, as if someone had walked into my home and rearranged the furniture without touching the pictures. There were statements with dates that overlapped with holidays when I had been at work or out of town. There were small, foolish purchases and larger ones, the pattern of someone trying to cover something with something else. And at the bottom, wrapped in a smaller envelope and folded like a paper boat, Bob had left me a letter. The first line was a punch of wind. "Maggie, if you're reading this, I'm already gone." I read it aloud even though no one else was in the room. It felt like speaking to a ghost. He wrote as if preparing a confession for a world that might never understand, and yet his hand trembled in the same way his voice had in the kitchen when he said he'd burned the roast. When I reached the middle, I found the words I had feared and known at once. He admitted he had taken out loans, that he had opened accounts in my name without telling me, that he had hoped to fix the losses from bad investments by borrowing against our house and using credit. He apologized, but the apology contained its own kind of arithmetic, a ledger between love and desperation. He wrote that he had not intended to hurt me. He wrote, "I thought I could make it right. I thought I could fix it before you knew." He repeated 3 times in different sentences, "Just keeping our future secure." There was shame in those sentences, and a man who had been trying to do 2 things at once, save the future and hide his failure. I felt like I had been reading a translation of his courage and cowardice. The letter ended with him begging me in softer ink, not for forgiveness, but for understanding, and maybe for me to be safer than he had made us. I sat on the bank chair and folded the letter into my palm like a talisman and a stone. My mouth tasted of metal. How could he? Is a question that felt too small and too large at once. It implied a moral universe in which questions had tidy answers. The truth roared back at me in fragments. He feared bankruptcy. He feared me. He feared shame. He had let those fears become the architects of secrecy. When I left the bank, the sun had melted into a dull horizon. Emily called me as I crossed the parking lot. Her voice was quick, as though she wanted to beat something to the air. "Mom, this is wrong. Dad he wasn't like that," she said, and I could hear the strain in her throat. Denial is a kind of refusal to be rearranged. "You sure you read the letter right? Could it be a mistake? Banks make errors." She was not cruel. She was protecting herself. And by protecting herself, she protected a memory she had built her adult life around. I told her what I had read. I told her about the folders, the numbers, the copies. She said, maybe he did it with good intentions to cover a bad bet. Maybe he thought he was shielding us. I heard the softness in her voice and the scaffolding of her defense. She wanted her father to be a man who made mistakes, not a conspirator in her mother's ruin. I understood that. I also understood that the world does not always give us choices between shiny absolutes. Sometimes we stand in the middle of gray, cold, and have to make decisions with hands that will shake. Back at home, I walked through rooms that were suddenly thin with possibility. Our photographs looked like props on a set. The kitchen table where he scratched notes with the back of a pen now looked like a place where secrets had been planned. I found his day book, a kind of pocket journal he'd kept for years. Next to the grocery list for avocados and eggs were little entries. Meet P2A, call on investment, he loan, ask about draw. He loan had never been part of our shared language. I had assumed his errands were small. He had built, in plain sight, a private ledger. That night I hardly slept. I replayed the routines in my head, searching for a sign. Times when he'd taken phone calls in the car and told me they were with clients. Times when he'd been late returning change from the hardware store. Small misdirections that now seemed like trails. I also remembered his kindnesses. The way he learned my coffee order, the careful way he untied my shoelaces when my feet swelled after a long day, the tenderness with which he'd smoothed my hair when I cried. Love can sit beside betrayal like two people sharing a bench. They may not be speaking, but they can both be true. The next day I went to the kitchen and wrote a list like a person preparing to climb a steep hill. Call bank, get lawyer, gather documents, contact Social Security, check retirement accounts. I felt almost absurdly bureaucratic, as though grief could be reduced to a filing system. But the list steadied me. It gave me a path through the fog. I went to see Patricia again, and this time she was quieter, more practiced. Mrs. Thompson, she said, closing her hands around a legal pad like a person holding something fragile. We can help you get copies of the documents attached to these accounts. There will be an internal review. But frankly, some of these matters may require legal counsel. There are loans and accounts taken out that we cannot simply reverse without the proper legal findings. Isn't it obvious these signatures aren't mine? I asked. I had practiced the question until it felt like a blunt tool. It might be, she said, but the bank has processes. We can flag the accounts. We can submit a report. But for anything that involves potential fraud and forged signatures, you will likely need to request a court order to have those debts declared invalid. That requires evidence. She used the word evidence like a hinge. The bank was sympathetic. The bank was constrained. I remember the absurdity of standing in the lobby of the bank and feeling like a stranger on my own map. The teller's smile, the hum of photocopiers, the soft chime when a door closed, all ordinary sounds that now echoed with a new, dangerous meaning. The house, the retirement I'd thought secure, the quiet of an ordinary life, they all felt like items balanced on thin reeds. I called an attorney recommended by a friend, Jennifer Rodriguez. She answered right away, and there was an urgency in her voice that matched mine. Mrs. Thompson, listen to me, she said, without preamble. We can start with an immediate challenge to the loans secured against your home and open a case on possible identity theft. There are steps we'll take to protect you, but you need to understand something. This will be messy. It will be painful. You will have to relive things in depositions. You will have to show that those signatures are forgeries and will need experts. She did not promise a tidy victory. She only promised she would try. and that was the kind of solemn, sensible pledge that felt tolerable. I asked her, "Can you protect the house?" She paused, and in that small silence I felt the measure of risk. "We will seek a temporary injunction to stop any foreclosure or sale while the matter is under review. But every case is different. We'll need to see documents, bank communications, loan agreements," she said. "Get everything you can. Everything. The boxes, the statements, even your husband's calendar entries." I felt the ordinance of my life shifting into procedure. Jennifer's voice turned the chaos into a shape I could enter. But even as I started to step into that shape, I could feel the strain in my family. David came over and sat across from me like an anchor. He was practical in ways his sister was not. "We'll get through it, Mom," he said, folding his hands like someone folding a map closed. He was the son who'd been taught to see problems as fixable. "We can fight them. We can prove fraud. We'll get a lawyer." Emily's response, as I said, was different. She wanted the world to remain as it had been. Husband, father, provider. Not a ledger of failures. When I told her we needed to talk to an attorney, she bristled. "Are you sure you can't just—" "I don't know, maybe next month?" she asked. "Dad always said he'd handle it." It was a plea to time, to denial. I asked her to come home for dinner. She said she would think about it. In the meantime, I had to do the small, practical humiliations that accompany being exposed to paperwork you did not know existed. I sat at the dining room table with a stack of statements and my own handwriting across a legal pad, the one with pages removed, and notes beginning to look like a will. I called the 3 major credit bureaus and placed fraud alerts. I called the investment firms and asked for account statements. Some representatives were sympathetic, others were bound by policy and sounded like night watchmen repeating rules that had been posted long ago. At the end of a long day, I found myself in my bedroom with Bob's letter in my lap. I read the apology again. There was an ache in me that had nothing to do with anger or grief exactly. It was the feeling of having been resituated in a world I had not chosen. The man who loved me had made choices about me without asking me. The violation felt intimate because it was intimate. Someone had traded on my name and my security to settle private failures. I thought about the Tuesday routine, the small, regular pilgrimage that had masked his private work. For all the trust that keeps a marriage breathing, secrecy is a kind of economy that siphons value away. Bob had performed secrecy like a currency. He spent it in small increments until the account was empty. The next morning I went to Ruth's bookstore because I needed a place that smelled of paper and calm. Ruth has a way of making a space in her shop that feels like a hand on your shoulder. Soft lighting, mismatched chairs, and a kettle somewhere in the back. She'd been our neighbor for years and knew not to pry. "You look like you carried a storm all night," she said, handing me a mug. Books have no agendas. People who work in bookstores are quiet clerks of stories. I told Ruth the parts I could say out loud, the box, the folders, the loans. Her face went through a slow lock of shock, then concern, then the kind of practical love that shows up with sandwiches and phone numbers. "You can take this down here if you like," she said, tapping the table in the reading corner. "We have women who come in late, exhausted, with burdens more than they can carry. Some of them meet here and talk. You don't have to do all of this alone." She didn't say the courtroom's name or promise outcomes. She offered presence, a place to sit, and an audience that would not judge. That, in the life I found myself inheriting, would almost be as vital as the lawyer's files. I began keeping 2 calendars. One was the legal kind, appointments, calls, documents to request. The other was a smaller human calendar, a brunch with Ruth, an afternoon with David, a call with Jennifer scheduled for the next week. It was my way of proving to myself that the life I had loved still had room inside it for ordinary daybreaks. But the strain at home was real and sharp. Emily stopped coming by. Our dinner table once the scene of small domestic conversations, became a place of silence and careful phrases. She called less. When she did come, she would say, "Maybe we should wait and see what the bank says. Maybe a mistake." Her eyes darted away when we touched the subject of loans. We were wilderness neighbors now, living within shouting distance, but separated by disputed land. What I did not expect was the way the community responded to the first rumor. A neighbor left a casserole at the door. Another woman I hardly knew knocked and offered to sit with me while I spoke to a creditor. Small acts of solidarity lined up like a fence around an exposed lawn. It's surprising how strangers can become the balm when family is fractured. Mrs. Alvarez from 3 houses down said softly as she handed me a card for a local nonprofit that helps people with identity theft. "You don't have to do this by yourself." The card was small, the words in thin print. The gesture was heavy. Weeks moved with the slowness of winter. I collected statements, scanned photocopies, and made lists of dates. Jennifer called and asked me several swift, practical questions. Who handled the household bills? Which accounts did I know about? Where did Bob keep his receipts? Then she asked, "Do you want to file the complaint now or wait until we've collected more evidence?" "What happens if I wait?" I asked. "Waiting risks the creditors taking action," she answered. "But filing too soon without documentation can also be complicated. We'll put an initial protective filing in place to buy time while we gather evidence." She did not promise anything beyond the attempt. I liked that. Honesty. As we talked strategy in her office, a small sunlit room with an enormous bookshelf and a silk plant in the corner, I felt like a person putting on armor. It did not make me braver, but it made me movable. The law, even at its slowest, is a tool that can convert fear into process. Still, every victory or plan mirrored a loss. The house was tethered to $270,000 in home equity loans that I had never known about. My credit was a ledger that now carried $96,000 in credit card debt. 2 numbers that felt like cliffs. 2 numbers that transformed everything I had assumed about safety into arithmetic that could topple me. Emily's denial hardened into a distance that felt almost territorial. At Thanksgiving that year, the conversation skirted these sharp rocks. She said, in a voice that was both defensive and pleading, "I don't want to believe he could have done that to you." She wanted to guard the memory of the man who taught her to tie her shoes. I tried to tell her the truth, the way you might tell somebody there's a leak in the roof, without blaming the person who put the tiles there. "He made decisions without telling me," I said. "He used my name. We have to find out the full truth." She put her fork down and didn't look at me. "Maybe he thought he would fix it," she said. "Maybe he was trying to protect you from worrying." That word, protect, kept returning like a bell. His secrecy had been framed as protection. The line between protection and manipulation is thin, and sometimes only distance reveals which it was. Days blurred into a rhythm of discovery and paper. I sat across from Jennifer one afternoon, and she slid photographs across her desk, copies of the loan documents, the credit card applications, and enlarged reproductions of signatures she wanted me to examine. I had thought, absurdly, that my own handwriting would be an anchor for me. In truth, looking at those signatures felt like watching a stranger write my life. "We'll hire a handwriting expert," Jennifer said. "We will also subpoena the bank's internal records and look for electronic traces, IP addresses, phone calls, anything that ties the accounts to your husband." A sudden wash of fatigue hit me. "Will that prove anything?" I wanted to ask. She gave me a careful look. "It will build a case," she said. "It will make a factual record that says this did not happen with Mrs. Thompson's knowledge. It's an important piece. There is a strange intimacy to presenting your life to strangers who are charged with judging it. In depositions and interviews, you are asked to recount ordinary things in exhaustive detail. Whether you used that credit card in March of 2018, whether you remember a particular phone call. Small truths become evidence. I found myself retracing days back to the texture of the carpet under my feet, the color of the sweater I had been wearing. When I told David that I was going to press forward, he squeezed my hand. "You don't have to do it for him," he said. "Do it for yourself." His clarity was both kind and hard. Don't let their definitions of your life be the only ones that matter. The more I moved through the motions of legal preparation, the more I understood how much of our shared life had been a performance of normalcy. Bob had been adept at keeping appearances intact. He had never been violent. He had been a good neighbor. He had been generous in ways that mattered. But generosity and secrecy can live in the same person like different chambers. They do not cancel each other out. At times I found myself replaying small moments where I might have asked questions and didn't. The mind is a craftsperson of hypotheticals. It builds windows that lead nowhere. But there were also the things I had done right. When he handed me a set of papers to sign, I had asked for time to read them. When things sounded off, I'd made notes. Those fragments of attention became small proofs that I had not been entirely naive. As the paperwork stacked up and Jennifer prepared to file, I started telling a few people my version of the story. Ruth, a neighbor, a woman from the church who taught knitting. The act of speaking turned something private into something public, and with that exposure came company. Women began to confide in me. Odd confessions at first about small identity thefts, about husbands who managed finances alone. Then more substantial things. A woman who had found unpaid bills in her name, another who had been blocked from seeing joint accounts. Our conversations were not catharsis simply, they were intelligence. Each story showed a pattern. Each small confession built a map. One afternoon, Ruth put a sign on the community board at the bookstore, a small typed note about a weekly meeting for women dealing with financial control and recovery. She left a box of tissues nearby and 2 chairs. "Just a place to talk," she wrote. The first week, 3 women came, shy, weary, grateful, and they told stories that sounded like mine in different keys. One woman, Maria, had been cut off from the couple's account after a divorce, finding herself blocked from money she had a right to. Another, June, had found a line of credit in her name she'd never opened. Their faces were honest in ways that truth sometimes is. Open, raw, not performative. Helping them did not erase the hurt. It did something quieter and more necessary. It put my pain into service. I found myself unexpectedly using my experience as a kind of lantern for others in their dark rooms. I read their statements with the same care I'd once read grocery lists. I held their hands when they cried. We practiced calling creditors together, practicing the phrases until they didn't feel like an invasion of privacy, but like a reclaiming of authority. And yet, even as I found purpose, there was a gravity to the documents that would not lift. The $270,000 of home equity loans hung over the house like an unlit chandelier. The $96,000 in credit card debt had a way of making the future look like a ledger with missing lines. I could imagine the day when a notice would come, a sheriff's agent, a bank statement in red, the uneasy conversation with a judge. I also imagined something quieter. The day I opened a bank account in my own name again, small and ordinary, and wrote checks that were mine. Some nights I would sit on the porch and imagine Bob not as a villain, but as a man undone by fear. That did not make the betrayal any less real. It only made it more complex. How do we hold 2 truths, a life of tenderness and an act of betrayal, without letting the weight of one crush the memory of the other? I don't know yet. I only know that the ledger of my emotions would not be balanced by simple answers. At the edge of this portion of my story, I had moved from being a passive reader of surprising documents to an active person preparing a case. I had taken copies, placed calls, found an attorney who did not sugarcoat the work ahead, and discovered a community that offered practical comfort. Emily's distance remained, and David's presence steadied me. Ruth's bookstore became a tacit headquarters of sorts, a place where wounded women could exchange numbers and resources without judgment. I am not yet at the courtroom. I have not yet heard Judge Harrison's voice pronounce any ruling. The verdict is still a horizon line. But I have reached a point where secrets do not remain hidden in a metal box. They have unfurled into rooms, into conversations, into the paperwork of law. I have felt the ground tilt under me, and I have started to learn how to walk again. If this sounds familiar, there are resources linked in the description below. I did not find them alone, and neither have the women who joined in that small bookstore circle. There are organizations that help with identity theft, attorneys who take on cases like mine, and others who can stand with you while you gather the documents that every law requires. The weight of those folders still rests in my memory. The smell of paper, the cold of the metal box, the smallness of the letters that admitted everything. When I read Bob's final sentences, I felt a strange kinship with his shame. I felt the fact of the man whom I had loved, the man who thought he could fix things without telling me. But in that same moment I felt something else, a growing clarity that my life could be reclaimed in pieces, that finances could be disentangled from love, and that I could work carefully, steadily, to make the house and my name mine again. The next steps were not simple. Jennifer needed more documents. Patricia promised the bank would cooperate with internal records. I needed to prepare emotionally for depositions and for the possibility of Emily's continued distance. There would be hearings and experts and the kind of slow legal machinery that grinds forward with a patience that can be both brutal and necessary. There were nights when I would wake in a cold sweat and feel as if I had been turned inside out. But there was also an oddly tender thing happening. Each time I talked to a woman who'd been through her own version of this, I felt less like a solitary figure carried into a storm, and more like a person who belonged to a convoy. We exchanged tips that weren't legal advice but were practical. Names of counselors, of reputable locksmiths who had helped after break-ins, of accountants who could help sort old statements. In a way, the heaviness of the box had catalyzed a community. For now, I carried the letter in my purse. I read it sometimes when the world was too loud, and the confession in it was a kind of mirror. I did not deny his love, and I did not excuse his choices. I learned to feel both things at once. There's so much left to tell. The hours in Jennifer's office, the first meeting with the handwriting expert, the letters to creditors, the first summons we filed, the way Emily finally sat across from me and listened. There is also the quieter story, how I came to open a small account in my maiden name, how Ruth taught me to catalog small victories with the same care I once reserved for grocery lists, and how a bookstore can hold the beginning of a new life. But those are stories that come later, each with its own pace. For now, the Tuesday ritual that Bob kept for 38 years is no longer a small domestic quirk. It is the spine of my story, the hidden ritual that kept a private ledger under the public facade of routine. The metal box was heavy, and what it contained was heavier still. But it also gave me something I had not expected, a reason to stand up and speak, to name the wrongs, and to begin the long work of putting pieces back together. The house still smelled faintly of his cologne in the evenings. I would trace the grooves of our pictures in the dining room and wonder how to live with a man who had been both my partner and this other thing. I would touch the mantel and see the small bronze clock he loved, the one that had been wound every Sunday. Life continued to be a mixture of small rituals and huge upheavals, and so I filed, and I called, and I gathered. I kept a ledger not only of debts but of actions, calls made, letters sent, hours in the car. Each item on that list was a small step away from being defined by what had been done to me and toward being defined by what I chose to do. The books on Ruth's shelves were a kind of kindling for that new life. The courtroom smelled like a library that had forgotten to air out. Coffee, cheap perfume, and the faint metallic tang of paper. People shuffled and found seats. Jennifer sat beside me with a file open and a look that said she had mapped this terrain before and intended to make it navigable for me. Across the aisle, the bank's counsel, polished, steady, arranged his papers. Judge Harrison took his seat with the sort of slow authority that makes a room straighten itself. I practiced breathing the way you practice a speech you never wanted to give. My hands rest in my lap. The past months have taught me that details matter, dates, tiny notations on bank forms, the way a signature tilts. All of that counted now. Jennifer leans over and whispers, "When they call your name, tell the truth you know. We'll handle the rest." The trial moves in stages like a tide. First, the bank explains its records, the paper trail that led to the loans, to the credit cards, to the accounts that carried my name. Their representative speaks with a guidebook steadiness. He reads numbers the way a person reads weather, neutral, inevitable. $270,000 in home equity loans taken out over a decade, $96,000 in credit card debt opened in my name. He does not say the word betrayal. He lists transactions. Then Jennifer stands. Her voice is plain and precise. She lays out how we discovered the box, how the documents were found, how the signatures bore the wrong angles and pressure. She asks the court to consider the letter Bob left, the one that begins, "Maggie, if you're reading this, I'm already gone." I had dreaded that read. I had worried the words would dissolve me into tears in front of strangers. When Jennifer passes the folded page to me, my throat tightens, but the paper is solid. I read aloud, steady, the sentences that were both apology and accounting. The letter is not legal proof on its own, she reminds the court. It is context. It frames motive. It admits intent. It is a map pointing toward a truth the rest of the evidence supports. We bring in a handwriting expert next, an older woman with a soft voice and the autograph collector's curiosity in her eyes. She lays the documents on a table and explains simply how she compares slants and pressure, how ink flows and hesitates. She does not perform magic. She shows method. She displays enlargements of signatures side by side, my genuine signature from old tax returns, and the lines on the loan documents that look almost right and are not mine. When she points out tiny differences, an extra loop, a heavier downstroke in a certain place, her finger finds them like a gardener finding roots. These documents were executed without Mrs. Thompson's authorization, she says. In my opinion, the signatures on the loans are not hers. The bank's counsel cross-examines with the kind of calm that is designed to unbalance. He asks if I ever signed papers without remembering, if I ever mailed forms from different addresses. He asks if Bob had a right in their household pattern to handle certain things. I answer as honestly as I can. I tell them the small truths that have become evidence. I paid utilities. I mailed the holiday cards. I did not sign these loans. I tell them how the credit card statements list purchases in cities I hadn't visited. Jennifer lets me speak without interruption. She understands that truth is both the content and the rhythm of what I say. Emily is in the gallery. I see her only in patches, her profile as she stares at her hands, the way her jaw is tight enough to teach the muscles anger. For months she held a faithful portrait of her father in her hands like a photograph, willing its edges to remain uncreased. Sitting there, I wonder whether she can watch the artifacts of his secrecy be unfolded. I imagine she thinks I have come to court to erase him. The truth is messier. I am here to ask the law to recognize that my name was misused, that our home was placed at risk, that the rust in our economy should not be allowed to rest inside a ledger in my name. There is testimony from bank employees about procedures, and from the handwriting expert about method. There are depositions I had given earlier, played back in clean, clipped audio. My voice reading off dates, transactions, the small that then this of how I built a case. Jennifer calls Patricia too, and Patricia explains the bank's internal process, how the safe deposit box was recorded in both our names, and how their policies require certain protocols upon a customer's death. Patricia's voice is careful. It is the voice of someone balancing customer care with institutional rules. The letter becomes a hinge. Jennifer asks the court to consider it not just as private sorrow, but as an admission that Bob had undertaken actions in secret to cover losses. He wrote that he had hoped to fix the losses, Jennifer tells the judge. He wrote that he opened accounts in Mrs. Thompson's name. The bank's records corroborate. The handwriting expert corroborates. She does not demand moral certainties. She asks for legal recognition that the loans and credit lines were procured by fraud and that Mrs. Thompson should not be held to debts she did not authorize. When the judge speaks, his voice is a measured instrument. He reminds everyone that the courts examine evidence and weigh it. He notes the letter, the handwriting analysis, the bank records. He draws a line between the human tenderness of apology and the legal standards of fraud. Given the totality of the evidence presented, he says, including a contemporaneous written statement by Mr. Thompson admitting to unauthorized actions and expert testimony concluding the signatures are not those of Mrs. Thompson, this court finds that the challenged home equity loans and the specified credit accounts were procured by fraud. The loans secured against the marital residence in the total amount of $270,000 are hereby declared void as to Mrs. Margaret Thompson. The court further orders appropriate relief to address the $96,000 in credit card debt identified as being opened in Mrs. Thompson's name. I remember the sound of the gavel. It is at once small and enormous. Relief is immediate and complicated. I'm buoyant, yes, but also hollow in the way one is after a tooth is pulled. Fewer aches, but an empty space that takes time to refill. Jennifer hugs me briefly in the aisle as if to anchor me back into a future that is no longer defined by those numbers alone. The legal victory is powerful. Real houses of law do still stand to protect people. But Jennifer's earlier caveat returns in my mind. Outcomes hinge on facts, jurisdiction, experts. This is our case. It is not a promise for others. It is a holding place where I may try to rebuild. Emily comes to the elevator with me when the court empties. Her face has been washed by something I cannot name. She looks as if she has been carrying a bowl that finally broke. She says, almost at once, "I didn't want to believe it." Her voice is small. "I thought, maybe he was protecting you. Maybe he thought he could fix it." "I know," I say. I reach for her hand. She squeezes it and lets go like someone letting go of a rope. "Do you understand now?" I ask. She nods once, then twice. An air seems to move inside her chest. She does not absolve him. She forgives in her own time, maybe, and more importantly, she looks like she will be here. "I should have listened sooner," she says, and there's a fatigue in that sentence that makes me both ache and feel seen. Reconciliation hums at the edges of this moment, not an erasure of pain, but a movement toward it together. Outside the courthouse, reporters ask for statements. I decline. The story is mine to tell on my terms. The house for the moment is safe. The cloud that threatened to settle over our neighborhood has been given a legal windbreak. That does not fix my credit ratios overnight, but it prevents the roof from falling in while I do the repair work. Back at Ruth's bookstore, the verdict arrives slowly like a conversation in a weathered room. Ruth makes me tea and serves it in a chipped cup. Women from the group come in with the cautious joy of people offering welcoming hands. Maria, June, and two others whose names I learn. They bring pie. We sit around a battered table and read the judge's words aloud as if reading a letter from a far place. When we reach the lines that name the amounts, $270,000 in loans, $96,000 in credit card debts, the room hushes. Then there are claps and small cries. Someone lifts a paper cup of wine, and we lift one too, not in celebration of the pain, but in recognition of a small, hard-won justice. The work after the verdict is quiet and mundane in ways that are good. There are calls to creditors, notices to be mailed, credit reports to be cleaned. I sit across from an accountant, and together we untangle years of statements. We set up payment plans where required, dispute remaining items, and make a new financial map. I open an account in my maiden name, one small, decisive action. That name feels like thin glass at first, fragile and new, but it is mine. I write checks with it and feel a small, steady joy as each signature lands true. At the bookstore, our support group grows. What begins as 3 women with tired shoulders swells into a regular meeting that draws a dozen or more. We exchange the practical and the tender, names of lawyers, always with the caveat, seek counsel, referrals to counselors who understand betrayal's particular ache, and the occasional volunteer offering to sit with a new woman at a creditor's call. We do not pretend to have answers that the law may not provide. We offer company and the kind of knowledge that comes from lived experience. We practice the hard sentences. I did not sign that. I did not authorize this account. This is ID theft. Saying them out loud makes them less monstrous. One afternoon, a woman named Teresa comes in trembling. Her energy is thin like a lamp on low voltage. She found a line of credit in her name after her husband left. She is frightened about eviction notices and unsure where to begin. We sit at Ruth's back table and look at her paperwork. We have no legal miracle to offer, but we give her what we have. A plan to gather documents, a referral to an attorney who works with survivors, and a promise to sit with her while she makes the calls. I feel a quiet sense of purpose in that work. The part of me that feared I might disappear into the paperwork instead finds a new shape, a woman who can guide others through the first bewildering steps. Time softens things in some ways. The house becomes less charged. The bronze clock still sits on the mantel, and I wind it sometimes. I keep his letter folded in a box, not to hide it, but to remember that confession had been offered honestly, however late. Jennifer helps me clear many of the financial thorns. The loans are gone from my name. Some of the credit card balances were discharged. Others required negotiation. The practical side of surviving opens into a new reality. Retirement accounts will need more years of work to be rebuilt, and I will probably work longer than I had once planned. Those are facts I did not choose, but facts can be met. Emily and I begin to have dinners again that do not circle the question of who her father was. We talk about small things, her job, David's grandchildren. She comes to a support meeting once, sits on the edge of the room and listens as women tell stories that echo my own. Afterward, she walks with me to the car and says, "I should have believed you sooner." She says it not as penance, but as acknowledgement. We do not erase the distance. We rebuild around it. Work at the bookstore becomes, unexpectedly, a new kind of livelihood and solace. Ruth hires me part-time. I organize book events and run the small recovery circle. I learn to use the register, to recommend a book to a woman whose hands shake, to pack purchases in brown paper with a little care. The income steadies me, but more than that, the work roots me in routines that are kind rather than secretive. I catalog small wins. The day I balanced a ledger without trembling, the first month I had a direct deposit into the new account in my maiden name, the moment I paid for my own oil change. These are modest. They are meaningful. I also begin to speak. Not at first in the courthouse or on the news, but in living rooms and church halls and a small nonprofits conference where they asked for someone who had been through the process to share honest accounts. I tell the story plain. I say the part that hurts and the part that healed. I say the numbers $270,000, $96,000, because figures anchor the abstract to reality. I tell them the legal outcome in our case, and I always follow it with a caution. Every case is different. Seek counsel, collect documents, tell someone you trust. Those sentences are small and sad and sensible. People begin to email me from cities I have never been to. A woman in Ohio writes that she found unpaid medical bills in her name after her husband died. A retired teacher in Texas says someone used her Social Security to open accounts. I answer the ones I can, always with an admonition to reach out to a qualified attorney, a consumer protection agency, or a local support line. I do not give legal instruction. I give what I have: empathy, the names of resources I vetted, the knowledge that you can rebuild. Sometimes, on a clear afternoon, I sit on the bookstore stoop with a cup of tea and watch people pass. The old couple who bought the same chipped vase last summer, the teenage boy with paint under his nails. I think about the way secrecy had nested inside our home like a second, quieter life. I think about the small rituals, Tuesday at 2, that hid something vast. I think, too, about the ways ordinary kindness persisted in Bob, the man I loved. Holding both truths is a strange discipline. It requires a space in the heart big enough to let two seemingly contradictory things coexist. The transformation I live now is not a tidy redemption arc. There are nights when I wake and the letter's lines press against the inside of my eyelids. There are days when a bank notice will arrive that requires a letter, a proof, a phone call. But there are also afternoons when a woman finishes telling her story at the bookstore and stands taller for it. There are conversations with Emily where we speak of memory and loss and the people we were and will become. There are the small paper lists I keep, appointments and a line for buy flowers, and the steadiness of checking things off. If someone asks me what changed everything, I tell them simply, the secret visits, the safe deposit box, his letter after he died. Those are the spine of the story. They turned a private ritual into a public reckoning. What followed was messy law, a courtroom, and a verdict that freed me from the worst of the debts that threatened our home. What followed after that was the slow, patient work of rebuilding a life that belongs squarely to me. If you find yourself in a similar place, know this: you are not alone, and legal avenues do exist to contest clear fraud. Getting help matters: qualified counsel, trusted community, and careful documentation. For those resources, I've gathered a list linked below: contacts for legal aid, credit repair organizations, and templates for support groups that have helped the women who came to Ruth's table. I can't promise outcomes for everyone. Each case depends on its facts, but I can promise community and direction. Share this if it might help someone else. Sometimes the small act of passing along a resource is the beginning of another person's recovery. My name is Margaret Thompson. My maiden name is Margaret Ellis now on a fresh bank account. I sign it slowly, with a careful hand that remembers both what was taken and what I reclaimed. The Tuesday ritual that defined so much of our shared life is now a part of the story I tell. It is the hinge between what I thought marriage meant and what stewardship of one's identity ultimately requires. I do not hate him. I do not excuse him. I carry both his tenderness and his betrayal, and I build from the space between, a house that remains ours, a community that offers shelter, and a life that I can call my own.